In this video, I'm going to give you a kind of whirlwind tour of what it looks like to work with RAD, to work with Fulcro RAD. The other video I've made, I'm actually encoding it as we speak, it's why my CPUs are all spinning. It's about an hour long and it covers more of some of the internal setup details, etc. I meant it to be more of a simpler overview, but there was a lot to cover, so it got long. So I'm making this one more of the shorter, kind of give you the quick lowdown of what it looks like. So if you want to see how to set it up, you can either look at the source code of this project and watch the other video. You can look at the RAD book online. Like I said, there are a number of resources, but I do want to just give a quick kind of overview of what's here, what it looks like to play with, and what you get out of it. So in this demo, I do have a login set up. The login is probably the least baked bit of RAD in general. But this, in dev mode, it even gives you just a filled in username and password just to make it easy for you to get in. The real power, though, and there's Timezone support, there's date time, there's routing. Like for example, if I go to view all and I pick some row and I change the sort order, and I have some settings like show inactive, and I'll disable somebody. So we see Sally's disabled. I'm sorted by name. I've got Sam highlighted. I can copy that URL, go to Safari, and paste that in, and I'll get, well, first I'll get a login. Oops, I don't have the forwarding after login set up on this project. And it'll take me to that exact view with that exact selected row with the same selected options. So this request parameter that's in here encodes things like what line I'm on, or what thing I have selected. You could see here in Chrome as I reselect the line you see over on the right around in here, it's actually updating that. This is actually a transit encoded base 64 encoded string of all of the parameters having to do with what I'm looking at. So you get some advanced HTML5 routing, and this HTML5 routing is not specifically tied to RAD. It's more just a layer stacked on top of standard Fulcro's dynamic routing. So don't think this is anything super special. You could actually just use that bit of RAD all by yourself. So let's look at this UI. And I cover the server quite a bit in the other video and a bit about the model in the other video. So I won't do any of that here. Look there for how the back end is working. I'm just going to talk mostly front end right here. Notice, however, these are all almost all CLJC files. Most of this stuff is meant to be used on the front end and the back end simultaneously. Some of the stuff is just front end only, like the client itself is a Fulcro client that I'm only going to run in a browser. So it's just a Fulcro RAD app, and this auth thing, like I said, is a half-baked authorization system, so don't pay too much attention to that. And then these are kind of the startup and reload development kind of bits. So on the front end, I've got Timezone support. So using the user's settings, like once you've got them logged in, you could reset the time zone, so then all of the date time controls and such will automatically morph to use their time zone for whenever a time is chosen. Route history is an add-on to RAD's routing stuff, again, that could be used just standard Fulcro. There's nothing super special about that. And this is the thing that's keeping track of things like route parameters in the URL and hooking up to the event system. This is how you hook up a UI plugin. In this case, I'm using Semantic Ui's plugin. And the rendering plugins are nothing more than a map of, for example, for forms to support a given data type with a given style. So, for example, a string default is just this render field function. A string that should be rendered as a password is render password, etc. So you can expand this map and install your own controls to support specific types and styles in the UI. And then you can look at these predefined functions for what that, what you would write. You can see here the divs and labels of the actual thing, and it's got pre-built functions that you can call to say, oh, well, they moved out of the input, they changed the input, and then the data model is just handled for you in terms of updating things, looking at, is it visible, is it read-only, etc. Those are all things that RAD has an opinion on how to do them that you can choose to use or not. And so this looks pretty much like a standard Fulcro client. If you look at the Fulcro RAD app, it really is just a Fulcro app with some preset things. It presets the HTTP remote for you, it adds in some EQL transforms, and it sets the renderer to a multi-root renderer because it needs that for some of its internal pieces. So, right, it's just a standard Fulcro app with some add-ons. All right, so the UI. So the only handwritten UI in this particular thing, and I use this for mobile as well, by the way. There's nothing specific to any of RAD's core code that has anything to do with UI. The UI is always in a plugin external, so there's no React DOM refs in Fulcro RAD. So you can use it with native. So you can see this handwritten part of the UI is only 108 lines long. That's all of the UI that I wrote for this entire project that has things like reports with graphs and pivot tables and alternate groupings and date ranges and invoices that have calculated fields and pickers and etc. Oops, hit the wrong key. So getting a lot of leverage there. So I'm using Semantic Ui and Semantic Ui React for my UI in this thing, and I've got a Semantic UI library that I use that just basically gives you quick and easy wrappers to the individual pieces of Semantic UI. So I want a drop-down menu. I'm using, this give me some doc strings and such, and then handle regular closure script props instead of having to pass pound.js data to these things. So I've got drop-down menus, and this route to function, if you look at it, is just a dynamic route, change route that has some extra bits, right? It looks to see if you've got history installed. It's got this absolute path helper that tries to figure out via, various bits where a particular route target lives in your UI. So dynamic routing can't guarantee a given component is unique within the hierarchy, but RAD, these routing helpers assume that you're only going to ever put a form that primarily deals with a thing in one place in your UI, so we can kind of safely just look for it, and the first one we find will be the right one. So, and it basically tells that. So don't use a route target in multiple paths in your application, because you can get an unpredictable result. And then there's the Semantic UI. No, is it Semantic UI, or is it? It's just a different namespace actually here. There's some history support kinds of things. So if you have history support, you can do things like back. Okay, so that makes these really easy. So even though account list could be nested somewhere deep in my UI tree, I can just say route to and just give it the class. Remember that there is a registry key to class function in Fulcro that lets you look these up by their fully namespaced keyword. So this guy is in common example UI account forms, account form, or account list, and so I could look that up, by putting a keyword version of that here. So this prevents circular reference problems. So I can do a route to, I can do things like form creates. On the route tos, I can pass specific things, like I can route to the invoices for account 101, right? That's how this link over here is working. Invoices for account 101. Yes, I want to go, and I don't have any. But any route params that you pass this route to will show up in the route parameters of the RAD components based on their controls and such. Okay, so this really is nothing more but a menu. So let's look at something more interesting. Let's look at the invoice. The invoice is probably the most interesting thing in this entire demo. So invoice list is a report. Now a report in RAD is really just something that runs a top level query. There's the query key, right, the source attribute. You can tell it what each row's, well, you have to tell it what each row's ID is going to be. So it doesn't necessarily know from this what the primary key of those things are. Well, it's just a keyword. It actually can't know. So this tells you what the primary key of these rows are. And then the columns lists out the things you want to show in the UI. Really, this just builds the query, and then the UI plugin can choose to show these based on things that are in the individual attributes. And these are attributes. So I can jump to one and look and see, oh, well, its field label on a form is name. It goes on account entities. It's in the datomic schema, production schema. Well, it's in the production schema, which I happen to know is a datomic database on this guy, and this attribute is required. So in this invoice list, here, let me put that to the right and this to the left. So view all, here's my invoice list, invoice number, date, customer name, and of course then I can do fun things like move a column, and the UI will update and the column will move. I can change things about the control layout. So if I want the new account to be on the left and the new invoice to be on the right, I can do that. I can define what controls are available, right? So this new invoice is a new invoice button whose action creates an invoice form using invoice form. All right, a form, similar sort of thing. It's just declarative. And these are all route targets. And you give them a route prefix to give them kind of a unique location. So if I go to, notice on this report, I've got a route of invoices. And then if I click on new invoice, I'm on invoice create, which is a subroute of this guy. So there's a lot of glue going on here, putting things together. And there are a lot of options and pieces and to many management, so on and so forth. Again, the book can kind of give you that, but I wanted to show you briefly what this looks like to kind of build up one of these. So it's UICLJC. So I've got all these various little RAD things in here. Oh, I've already got form. The important thing to note is that these macros, let's see now, let's make a new form for widget. And then I want form options so I can get my doc strings, because I don't remember these very well either. Okay, so all right, so let's say this is going to be widget ID, and I don't have widget yet. So I'm going to go to my model directory here. I'm going to create closure CLJC widget namespace. I'm going to go and grab, say, maybe addresses requires, and then maybe I'll grab an ID attribute. I'll call this widget ID. It's not SQL. It's going in there. And then let's say I want widget name, which is a string. It's not an identity, but it's in the production schema. Back over my UI, now I can say give me okay, so now, and this guy will give me, oh, excuse me, I did at line 7 on widget. Oops. Okay. Oh, let's call that widget label so we don't have conflict in our closure functions. Okay, and then if I look at my console over here, this is probably giving me a warning telling me it's not going to be a routable thing because I didn't give it a route. So widget form does not have a route prefix and will only be used. All right, so form option route prefix widget. All right, so that should load up and I should be okay. Now I'm going to go to my main router here and I'm going to add widget form to my target list. Okay. Now I haven't added widget to my database model yet, so I'm going to say def attributes ID and label. So I'm just creating a vector of the things that I've defined in this namespace, and then I've got a model CLJC kind of top level thing where I track all of my so I'm going to add that to my model, QRSTVW. All right, that's a CLJC file. So now both my client, which I'm going to reload just to make sure that it gets its stuff up to date from that those model changes, and my server is configured to use this to figure everything out. So if I go over here and restart my server, I'm going to clear this. Oops, wrong key. Clear that first. I'm going to restart my server with my keyboard shortcut, and I'm going to scan through this and see if it said anything about widget. It does not seem to have said anything about widget. Oh, sorry, I'm searching in the wrong window. There it is. Checking schema production attribute for widget ID, for widget label. Here's my auto-generated schema migration that it made. So it made widget ID an indexed UUID, unique identity, and widget label a string. Oh, and I just discovered a bug. In order to tell this what entity this particular attribute lives on, I have to tell it which things identify it. So I could have a widget label, I could have a widget weight. So I'm restarting again, and so notice that lots of time zones. This is my data migration that got generated. So if I look for widget in there, here we go. Widget ID, widget label, widget weight, type double, widget, we check the schema. So there's 3 things the Datomic plugin supports. It supports checking your schema, so if you want to generate yourself, fine. It supports generating it, optional. It's a good idea to at least have it check it to make sure your model matches what's in the database. And then building resolvers. And building the resolvers happens from this identities thing. So the identities thing basically says, if you give me a widget ID, I can give you a label. If you give me a widget ID, I can give you a weight. And so this resolver basically says, give me a widget ID and I can give you a label and weight. Right? So we have automatic network API generated from that. If I go over here into inspect and go to the query tab and ask for my indexes here, I could do a join on widget ID, and it should know now that oh, sorry, that should be an ident. Widget ID 1 subquery of widget label or widget height, weight, whatever. Right? Of course, there's not a widget in the database, so it tells me that's not found. But notice it understands what I'm talking about. This also gets me save support because my Datomic plugin already knows how to take a diff off of this and put it in the database. So I got my network API, I got my schema validation, I got my schema generation. All I had to do was declare my data model and say it was in this schema. And then the schema, of course, is defined in the server-side stuff. Watch the other video for that. Okay, so now I've got those. Let me go back to my UI here. So FO attributes. This is my list of things. Oh, I don't have a render for doubles. Let me change that to numeric. Yeah, my rendering plugin doesn't understand doubles yet. I almost, in the software I write, it's almost all money, so it's all big decimal, which I think I do via numeric. Oh, decimal. Decimal is what I call it. Right, that's a big decimal data type. So I'm going to restart my server, let it tell me that now weight is a big decimal, which I'm sure it is. I'm not going to worry about looking at it again. Okay, got my attributes. Those are installed. I've got my network API. I can come back over here. I can say that widget form should let me edit the label and weight. And so now I should be able to go down here and let's add ourselves a new menu called widget create widget form. There's my widget form. Oh, that looks lovely. I forgot a title. And my renderers, obviously. Like I said, the rendering is like the, but again, you're probably, the whole point is you're not going to necessarily release the rendering bit to the world. It's sort of back end, stand it up quickly. There we go. That fixes the header. So label, some label, weight 42.0. I'm going to open the developer tab here, show you Fulcro inspect on here, show you the network, and say save. So you can see what went across was a save form. It knew this was a new thing, so it had a temp ID. And in the delta, it said the widget ID was this temp ID. It had a label that used to be nothing and is now some label, and it had a weight that used to be nothing and it now is 42. The back end, and then it has a follow-on query that says and reread it from the database once you've saved it. So this basically saves it and then rereads it. So if we go look at our back end saw save was invoked. It looked up and found all the schemas that were involved in that because it could save across multiple databases. Then the Datomic database adapter found the bits that were of interest to it, turned that into a transaction, added it to the database, and then this is it rerunning the query to return the response to the client. And if I look at the response here, you'll see save form returned temp ID remapping, and then the things that were saved in the database. Okay, so I've got one in the database now. I could go and add another one. Other widget, weight 99, save. Okay, so now I got a couple in the database. How how do I look at them? Well, that's the purpose of a report. And you do have to name these. Don't be tempted to do that. These macros actually just spit out a defsc, and they actually use whatever symbol you give here internally. That could be fixed, but I just haven't had the time. All right, so I haven't imported that one. So let's copy these two and say report and report options, report as RO. Move that back to the right so we can see if there are compile errors as we go. And okay, what does it not like about this? Okay, missing invalid option. Okay, so report needs report option slash, let's see if I can remember. It needs to know the route, so we're going to show the widgets here. It needs to know the row primary key, which is going to be, is that a keyword or an attribute? An attribute. Going to be widget ID, and it's going to need to know the columns that you want to see. So let's just look at widget label. Is that all I need? Nope, still missing something. Invalid option. Oh, source attribute. I have to tell it where to find. So I have to write a top-level query that can find those. So I'm just going to go back to the model widget namespace, and I'm going to put it in here. And this is going to be a ref type. It's not going to be in a schema. It's not going to have identities. Instead, what it's going to have is a PC in no input, a PC output, where this is a pathome connect. Right. So in the other video, I mentioned some of the details of this, but basically, an attribute can specify how it's resolved. You could also just define a resolver, but if you define it as an attribute, you get some other pieces out of it sometimes. So my output here is going to be a join on widget all widgets on widget ID. And then my resolve function is going to be a function that gets the env, and I'm going to go look at database queries to just remind myself of how I get that database out of the env. So there's the way I get the production database out. And so I'm going to run a query where I have a widget ID on an entity, and I'm going to pull all those IDs, and I'm going to map over that. I'm going to say widget ID. Oops. That's going to be my vector, and then this should be widget all widgets of that vector. And then I need the datomic add all widgets to the list of attributes. This is I can define this in CLJC, but when I do the resolve, I have to do that only in Clojure. And what else do I have here that's wrong? Oh, I don't have the datomic namespace in here. Okay, that should fix that up. I should be able to restart this, maybe not. Line 31. Oh, pff. Okay, so now back to my query tab, load my indexes, and let's try out this widget. All widgets, widget ID, or widget label. Oh, I don't have any widgets in there. Ah, wrong number of args. Okay, so we did screw up our query here. Wrong number of args, pass to model widget. Oh, there is no input in this particular case, but that's a 2arg function. Okay, so if we go back here, new backend, so it lost my, save those, run that query. Okay, so my query's working. Okay, so you see how, basically just write a database query and resolve the IDs, and then once the ID is resolved, the automatic resolvers can go from IDs to labels or weights. So now my report back in the UI has everything it needs. I can get a source attribute of widget all widgets, tell it what the columns are, tell it what each row is going to have a widget ID. That's for like linking to forms and that sort of thing. And so now widget list needs to go in my list of routes. And now widget list should be something I can route to. Oh, what did I call it? I just misspelled it. Oh, and route to takes parameters. Oh, no, it doesn't take parameters. No, it does. Sorry, what is it complaining about? Oh. Why do I have that? Oh, I'm editing the wrong line. Okay, and it does take parameters. These parameters show up and allow you to set controls on a report dynamically, so anything you pass here will actually show up in the control settings. Okay, so now I should be able to go to my list widget, and oh, I didn't give it a control, and I didn't tell it to run on mount, so it didn't show me anything. There we go. So there's my report. And then you just build out from there. So and these, again, this stuff's in the documentation. And then most of these things are as simple as, see, I think you get the instance of this in that lambda. What is it called? Yeah, run report, which takes this. Okay, so let's take the run on mount off of here. Reload this, we should get an empty report. I don't know why it lost my session. Like I said, the login's not quite there. Run. Okay, so now I've got a way to update the report. Now, the thing that I wanted to show you next was that you're getting a lot of just automatic stuff here, but then you might be wondering, well, but what if I don't want the automatic thing? Or what if I'm working on this in some other context? I want to use your Semantic UI. I'm in native. There's no native plugin yet. Well, as soon as you want, you can just take over the UI. And the UI has in it exactly what you'd expect in a Fulcro component. Oh, there is no label yet because I didn't go to edit one. Here, let me do is it links? Map from qualified key, or is it link, or is it form links? That's what I want. Form links. Shorthand returning in column values links. Okay, so I could say for widget label, because that's on the report, use widget form. And now if I go to list widgets and click on the label, it'll take me to that form with that guy's label. So now I'm editing, right, that widget. So, you know, now I can just make a DOM input whose value is that, and on change I'm going to have a function that gives me an event, and I can use EVT. This is a standard Fulcro helper that's in CLJC. Hopefully it's in CLJC. Yeah, see, that's a CLJC file, so it's got like predefined things that will compile in CLJ and CLJS, but will give you things like event target value in CLJS. So it's just handy to, when you're building CLJC files. So the target value of the EVT, and then what I want to do here is, in order to get the form logic support, I can use the form namespaces input changed event, and notice this takes a rendering environment, and it's looking for form instance and master form. You can have nested forms, so basically you just set both of those : form keys to this. So form changed, and I should make a helper function for this. I think that's what that takes. Oh, key and value. Form instance, master form, key. Okay, so over here I can go find my widget. There's only one that's real, right? I've got that other one that I started to add but didn't save. So there's my LJ, right? So now I'm editing the widget label. I'm in control of the UI, and then when I decide I want to, when I decide wherever it is that I want to put my save button, same sort of thing. It takes a form rendering environment. The renderer can pass anything down through that map, but the only thing that's required is what's listed in the kind of the doc string there. So again, the forms can be nested if you look at the rendering source code. Okay, so I'm going to go look at the network. I'm going to clear this. I'm going to click on my save. You see the diff go across. We see the transaction go in the database. We see the requery. The response on this gives me the new thing I typed in. So this is really, you know, to me the crux of it is, if I like what RAD does for me in the auto-generated rendering plugin, all right, use it. As soon as I don't want to use it, all right, don't use it. You still get the logic of load, of save, of minimal form diffs. Notice that this save here just sent label, even though it knew weight was one of the things that could be saved. It hadn't changed, right? So when I have this this guy here, and form state's been around in Fulcro for years, if I take that F off, notice the buttons change. Now if I'm literally going to type the letter F, notice it could figure out that the form's now unchanged. There was no I/O to the server or anything. It actually keeps a copy of the original form values. So that lets me, if I put some crazy thing in here and say undo that, it knows how to undo it. So all of that stuff is available to you in the form namespace as just helper functions. So you want a DOM button for undo in your custom thing. Read the doc string, needs master form. Now I've got something where I can click undo and it undoes it. So there's nothing about RAD that locks you into anything. This save support is a piece of middleware. The datomic is a piece of middleware. Delete support is a piece of middleware. In fact, the only thing that's really at the center point of all of this is just a path home resolver, a path home parser. And I covered the details of this in the other video, but this parser, notice there's a plugin for the forms, there's a plugin for doing datomic stuff, there's a plugin for image handling, there's a plugin for handling server-side, matching the server-side time zone up with, like, you could look at the request here and figure out what their time zone is. And then this is just the list of resolvers, and these resolvers are, a lot of these are just like the automatic resolvers, which is a combination of the datomic generated resolvers and the ones that, like, I hand coded in widget, right? This function finds these that have PC resolve on them and puts them in this list. That's it. So any one of these pieces can be augmented just by defining a resolver, like so. You can use Pathome's regular def resolver and just stick it in the parser, right? That gives you the network API, and as soon as you have the network API, the backend's happy, right? If you can save the thing via resolvers and you can load the things via resolvers, and save, by the way, since that's a minimal diff, is usually about 150 lines of code for just about any database. Because the attributes can describe, right? You can hang anything you want on these to describe, say, how a ref works, or like, are you using a many-to-many table in SQL, whatever. You can just hang that information right on here and then add a piece of middleware that understands your description. And so that's how all of this, what looks like magic is happening. It's actually really pretty straightforward. I've mentioned this schema thing and this identities thing, right? This combines to figure out how to join these together in a resolver for querying, but this also is used to figure out, okay, when I have a widget ID and it tells me widget label, I'm putting that thing on that weight that just came in on a save, it goes on the widget with that widget ID, right? There's kind of bi-directional information capabilities here, and these are open maps, right? Invent your own. And then these attributes end up, again, in the parser. This plugin, all it does is puts this key, it just puts a key to attribute thing on the path home in, so you can look up by keyword the attribute definition for one of these attributes, right? You can actually find this map. Defatter is nothing more than something that ensures that you have to give it an optional doc string, a keyword, a type, and then a map. And then all it does is it takes the keyword and type and calls new attribute with them, which just puts them under well-known keys. Right, so all an attribute is in RAD is a map that has : attribute type, : attribute qualified key, and then any number of key value pairs that have to do with anything you care about: validation, form field label, column label, right? And I've defined some of these just for convenience. So if we go back to the UI here, we go back to the say we go back to the report. Right now it's giving an uppercase version of just the symbolic name of the widget here, but I can bring in something like that. And really, the only trick I'm doing here, I'll show you. If we go and look at the Semantic UI controls, and I go find the table rendering logic. So report style to layout. This is a table-based report. Render table layout. Oh, actually, this is in the report.cljc, I think. Oh, the other one. Basically, I can just pull out of any report instance the component options and then look for things on them. So any custom renderer can just assume it has access to any of these things for customization. So form options has things like validation message, but it's just stuff I invented, right, for a particular renderer, and then it was kind of general. So the validation message for a widget label is you must supply a label and now inside of my rendering code, so I'm going to go back here and I'm going to say in my rendering code here, what is I can do it this way to make it a little more right. I can hand write my own validation here, right? I can look and see, on the on widget label, does it have an attribute, option required? I have to go in here and fix that. Well, I don't have it. Oh wait, that was FO. Right, so I can pull these out, and I don't know, I'll just throw something in here to show you that, right? So that's the basic trick of RAD, is I'm just hanging things on these attributes, and then because I've got them as attributes, these are maps that I can just look at and pull data out of and form my UI. Now, I don't want to hand write that every time, so why not just make some custom functions that understand some typical ones, and give me my label next to my, or my error message next to my label, do the color highlighting, give me some additional things, prevent save. Like, all of that logic is a lot of crap to write, and you just write it over and over and over again for these things. A lot of these forms and reports are just back-end things that only you see, and so who cares? And if the public sees them, well, you can make them prettier or style them however you want, change the CSS theme of the CSS toolkit, what have you. But this idea of open maps for both these properties and for these, right, you can invent your own here. And then inside of the code, whatever code, wherever, right? So let's say your renderer, you've got some custom function, and you're going to pass it widget form, or you're going to pass it this. Well, it turns out you can pull the component options from this or a class, and oops, map literal starting with FID. Oh, sorry, gotta have an even number of, right? This is all of the options that are included on this defsc. You see things like ident and query and validator, stuff that we didn't manually put here, but this macro is throwing there. So we could ask for component options, invent, and we could say invent 42, and we'll get 42 in the UI. Right. So this is the other piece of how RAD works, is you go to write this custom rendering, and you can do whatever you want, and all you really have to do is pass this in, and from this you can find the attributes, and from the attributes you can find what to render, and from and how to validate them, and what to put as their column headings, and are they required, and what do they go with, and etc., etc., etc. So I find it to be a really elegant way to organize things and end up with really tight code that you can throw together really rapidly. I mean, you saw how fast that I was able to just get like some brand new entity in my database. These things can be nested. You can go and play with this demo and see, right? This is a nested to one with a nested to many with file upload. And this is just all, right? There's my file upload, and notice it knows it's unsaved. I was having a problem with this earlier. This has a validation on it that checks that it's just a silly validation. Additional addresses. And if this does save right, which I hope it does, I was having a problem with my validators earlier, you'll see on the network here that what I got was a diff that was normalized. Right? So I got that I was saving account with this ID, it's a temporary ID, with a name this, a role user, a time zone of that, email, active, and then notice the primary address is an ident. And then back at the top level, I've got an ident for address and the temp ID and the address facts, and an ident for another address and the address facts, and an ident for well, this is the file upload kind of information. They're uploaded by SHA, and a separate post is used to actually transfer the file information. And so since this is normalized, really, if you think about the save routine on the back end, all you have to do is be able to figure out that account, an ident that says account ID and an ID, well, that's going in the account table or in a new entity of type account. And I want to put these columns or these attributes on the entity, SQL, Redis, Datomic, whatever. It's really easy to turn this normalized diff, which has proper refs, right? It's not a nested thing. So you can sort by leaves first, right? Transact the leaves and then transact these guys, and you get the whole thing in the database. So nesting, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is nested kinds of things are trivial to support in this system, and even though it's a reasonably large amount of code to write. And I can get the download. I can go see, this is a picture of some roots that in a plant experiment I was doing. And that's all tightly packed in here, where I've got everything. I'm sorry, that's the report. That's the list item for the report. So right here's the form. Something I didn't show that's kind of fun is it's really easy to invent things like layout. So in the address forms, I've got this added key where you can give like a vector of fields, and this is how the layout's working, right? So if I go here and I oops, wrong key. Let's undo that. I split that guy and make another row. Now zip will be on the last line. Right? So this is just kind of a silly way to tell, a grid-based HTML system how to lay things out, and Semantic UI is responsive. So when I get too tight, it just does linear, but it kind of hints it to be, oh yeah, I'd like those on the same row. So, you can get a pretty decent looking, pop over to account and do the same thing. And I've even added here recently, so let's go to account form. I didn't do layout on this one, right? I added one for tabbed layout. In tabbed layout, you give it a vector and a combination of things like strings. So we could say, like the primary stuff and then the secondary stuff. And then in here you can say, okay, on row 1 I'm going to have account name and account role, and in the secondary I'm going to have account primary address, right? You can just kind of build this up. So now in the secondary tab, right? So it's just kind of fun to just play with these. The rendering for this for the Semantic UI stuff is in the what is it, the RAD form. Where's the form layout stuff? Yeah, so here's tab layouts. It's just, that's it. Just make a pointing menu and then walk over the stuff. So it's a pretty tight little bit of code, and then I'm using component local state to just keep track of which tab I'm on. But it's essentially just one form where I'm just choosing to render part of it one at a time, and the Semantic UI just happens to have something that looks reasonable for that kind of layout. So I encourage people to kind of start with RAD and play with it, and just see how you can kind of get moving quickly, get some data in a database, play with it, and then see state management happening. And then when you want to add something that just does the thing you want it to do, well, then you just hand code it, and maybe you have logic that comes along with it because you use one of these special macros. And by the way, these are just using UI state machines, and you can actually override oh, I don't have it documented yet. You can actually override what state machine definition to use. So if you go and look at this macro, it just emits a bunch of stuff in the oops, wrong one. Convert options is the primary place. It just adds a bunch of options to the defsc that it emits. It just emits a defsc that has all this extra cruft on it. But the state machine it starts, so that's on will enter. So that's just standard Fulcro dynamic routing. Right? It adds this will enter stuff if there's a route prefix, and the form will enter does the initial like setup of interpreting the route params and that sort of thing. So you can kind of start with a piece of it, get some database stood up really fast, get a model and network API going really fast, get some little reports and widgets going in. And if you look, there's some more complex, like this dashboard thing. This is a control that lets you coordinate multiple multiple things on one screen. So these shared controls here, like if I change this to say February of 2020, notice these went through March. The data only goes through March. So if I back it up, you see the chart, like these are shared controls that get pulled up from these individual pieces. And notice that I've highlighted that, I turned that on, reload HTML5 routing remembers all of those pieces, so you can bookmark these things. So the fact that you get, and that HTML5 routing, again, this is just like some add-on to Fulcro's dynamic routing. It's not tied to, you have to use RAD. You don't have to use a single DefSC form or report to use the routing pieces. So I'd encourage you to look at what's there, look at the book, kind of study the source and the video, and see what you see. Thanks for watching.